Hey, hey, hey! My name's Hellion the Scripted, or Nephilim if you'd prefer. Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is the 9th chapter of my favourite Kiribati Mulane U written by XX Cypress Minerva XX on AO3, which is entitled Eijirou. I didn't expect another chapter so soon, and it is exciting. We must all heed the warning that is made during the author's note. I hope you enjoy this chapter. It's downhill from here, which is finished off with a smiley face. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 9. Black and Blue, Red and Orange. The air surrounding the soldiers was solemn as they set out once more. eijirou falls into step with the other soldiers, steps thudding softly against the snow. But his gaze was clouded and his jaw was clenched tightly. A feeling was building in his chest as he trudged through the snow. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it, but whenever he closed his eyes, images of the burning village danced before his eyes. The screams of the dead roared in his ears, because, god damn it, he couldn't do anything to save them. Even though they were nestled in the carriage Tokoyami was pulling along, they could sense his discomfort. Jiro chirps softly, worry evident in her tone, and Denki nods grimly in agreement. eijirou, no doubt, blamed himself for how things had turned out, as strange as it was, considering there was no possible way he could have done anything for those men, the villagers. eijirou blamed himself for their deaths, and as selfish as that sounded, Denki knew he should have expected it. Because eijirou was kind, and no doubt the detached look on the young captain's face had destroyed the redhead. But there wasn't much for eijirou to do other than look at the scenery, instead of march by Bakugo's side like he wanted, to make sure he wasn't alone. He stares at the blonde's back, arched straight despite the horse's skittish movements. Even if Bakugo was still in shock over his countless losses, eijirou wasn't able to tell. He sighs through his nose. They were in the deepest parts of the Camino Pass now, and snow-capped mountains rose up above them as they travelled through the valley. The Imperial City wasn't far now, and if all went well, they would arrive before the League came close. eijirou's chest fluttered with hope, and he couldn't help but quicken his pace a bit, hands tightening on Tokoyami's reins, carriage wheels creaking in the snow. The noise was so loud that he didn't hear Denki and Jiro bickering within. "Well, I'm a frickin' electric type, not a fire type!" A series of chirps mocking his voice. "I can totally make fire! I'm not completely useless, you know!" A spark, a flare, a boom. eijirou startled as a cannon rocketed itself out of the carriage, breaking the tarp that was carrying them. It was shot into the air, higher and higher, before exploding in a shower of sparks. eijirou whipped his head around to stare at the hole in the carriage. Denki peered his head out, offering a sheepish grin. But before eijirou could reprimand them, he was spun around by rough hands. "What the fuck was that?" Bakugo demanded, suddenly right in front of eijirou. He's wrenched forward by his costume strap, so close that he can feel the blonde's breath on his face as he snarls. "You just gave away our position, you idiot!" eijirou's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stood there gaping like a fish out of water for what seemed like an eternity. I don't know, it just... He never got to finish his sentence. "Duck!" Sero shouted, and that was the only warning they got before a hail of arrows began to descend from the sky, slicing through the air in a delicate arc. The soldiers scrambled to act. They may have been inexperienced in the ways of war, but Bakugo had made sure they were well prepared. "Save the cannons!" Bakugo ordered, and eijirou's hand became hard with his quirk. Tokoyami frantically bucked at his harness as the arrows rained around them, and eijirou cut him loose from the cart with a precise stroke. "What's happening?" Denki cried as he and Jiro rushed out of the cart, taking their place in eijirou's costume once more. "You gave away our position!" Eijirou shouted, not worrying about being overheard in the commotion. Eijirou grabbed Tokoyami's reins and led him away, as fast as he could. Then suddenly, he stumbles. He glanced down and immediately recoiled, his gut turning. A soldier. Their helmet had been knocked from their head, and brown eyes stared up at him, moving slowly as they spat out blood onto the snow. It was the boy from earlier, whose staff had been knocked from his grip during training. The one who seemed so familiar. Now there was an arrow sticking out of the chink in their armour. "Help them!" Their voice was low, almost feminine, as he urged Eijirou to move away from him. "Please, just go, please." Of course he knew he had to move. This was war. Eijirou knew people would die, but he wasn't prepared for it to happen in front of him, for the people he knew, people he'd trained with. "Keep moving!" Denki piped up. "You can't do anything for him now!" But Eijirou didn't listen. He checked the boy's pulse, which was weaker than normal, but still steady. "Kirishima, leave him!" Eijirou ignored Denki's pleas and without a second thought slung the boy over Tokoyami's saddle. He couldn't falter now. "Watch out!" Someone behind Eijirou called out a warning, and it was immediately followed by a huge explosion. The redhead looked behind him, but could only see flames. The cart holding the cannons had been hit by a fire arrow, and the cannons had all detonated. The snow around it rapidly melted from the heat, and it left behind a sickening red slush. He could make out a few mangled limbs through the flames. People who were unfortunate enough to be caught in the detonation. "Keep moving!" Denki urged. Eijirou turned away and forced down his terror. He did his best to shield the soldier with his body as he leads Tokoyami, sprinting down the snowy pass, to an outcropping of rocks that the surviving soldiers were huddled behind. It was a sad sight. They had never been a particularly large force, but most of them already lay dead from the onslaught of arrows and the explosion. Now they only had a few dozen soldiers, the captain, Endeavour, and a handful of cannons. "Return fire!" Bakugo shouted, ordering Sero and Todoroki to position the surviving cannons for their attack. It was a terrifying minute as the cannons went off one by one. Their supply was dwindling, but they continued to fire into the distance, hoping to hit something, anything. But eventually the moment passed. The world stopped holding its breath. The onslaught of arrows slowed. Bakugo held out his hand, stopping Sero from lighting the final cannon they had. Everything was silent. And then a war cry rang out through the air, echoing off the mountains. From the corner of his eye, he sees Bakugo's shoulders tense, the soldiers still, and Eijirou feels his heart leap into his throat. Tokoyami shifts the unconscious soldier on his back, and the redhead jerks his chin. The horse nickers softly, and then he's walking, further and further away from the army until he's out of the range of the fight. With a thundering roar, the League of Villains appeared over the horizon. Hundreds, thousands of soldiers. Some on horse, some on foot, they all charged towards what was left of the hero's army. Some soldiers stumbled back, terrified by the might of their foe, but most of them looked to their captain for instructions. They were soldiers. They weren't the new kids in the training yard, not anymore. They would fight, and Eijirou braced himself for whatever Bakugo would say. He would follow them to the ends of the earth, because he was a soldier. Because he was Bakugo's friend. "Stand your ground!" Bakugo's voice was quiet, but tinged with determination, with strength. "If we die, then we die with honor!" Honor. Such a coveted thing. No set manual on how to attain it. But everyone was expected to do it regardless. Not long ago, Eijirou would have died in peace, knowing he had finally found what he so craved. But he was selfish. He wanted to live, for as long as he could. For Tamaki, Togata, his father, Denki Jiro. For Bakugo. So he drew his arms and he stood firm, body hardening with his quirk as he braced for the impact. Denki patted his nape, a silent reassurance. A quiet, "We're with you." Over the crest of the mountain, the League came closer and closer. Leading them, riding just ahead, was a man adorned in armor made of bones, sword clutched tightly in his hand. There was no way he wasn't the leader of the League, the fabled Shigaraki. He had been terrorizing Japan, and it would all reach its climax here. Wait, why can't Todoroki just freeze them, or blast them with fire, or Midoriya, Kirishima? They're the powerhouses here, a soldier says nervously, cowering under the captain's harsh glare. I mean, why shouldn't we use our quirks? Idiot! If we use our quirks just for offense, we'll all die! We're outnumbered! Another soldier scolds him, and Eijirou sees the captain roll his eyes. Aim the cannon at Shigaraki! We're ending this shit now! Bakugo bared his teeth when he caught Eijirou staring, and some sick part of the redhead wondered if that would be the last order he ever gave them. Todoroki nodded and adjusted the cannon's trajectory. Eijirou watched the League advance, their horses kicking up snow as they ran. The snow floated up into the air in a cloud, and Eijirou idly thought that it would be brilliant if the snow could just rise up and suffocate the League, stopping the army in their tracks before they even reached them. Wait. Eijirou didn't have time to explain himself. He sprung forward and yanked the cannon and flint from Todoroki's hands. What are you doing? Sero shouted after him. Eijirou didn't waste time responding, already sprinting out of the rock's cover to find a better angle. What are you doing? Denki screeched and Eijirou dropped into the snow, planting the cannon down and fumbling with the flint. You have a death wish? Are you insane? I have a plan! Eijirou shouted back, fighting to get the flint to light. Or an idea, at least! I can save them all! The League was getting closer and closer, and in a few more seconds they would be upon him. Eijirou could see the whites of Shigaraki's eyes as he bowed forward, watching as he shouted orders to a burly man beside him. Stares in horror as the man, a known villain named Rappa, lumbered forwards, cracking his knuckles. There was no more time. Eijirou snatched Denki from his collar, shoving him next to the fuse. Light! He demanded, and Denki's body hummed with electricity, a small stream of lightning bursting to life, a small flicker of flames melting the snow around it. Eijirou shoved Denki back into the sash around his hips, adjusting the cannon angle once more. A few seconds left till it went off. Eijirou's heart leapt into his throat as a shadow hovered over him. Staring down at him was Rappa. They stared at each other for a long moment, locked in a silent contest that neither could back down from. But the fuse ticked down further and further, and Eijirou knew he had won. He ducked his head and the cannon went off with a bang. It shot off far away from any of the soldiers in the pass. You missed, you stupid kid, Rappa said. His voice was gruff, emotionless, but tinged with a sense of certainty that Eijirou couldn't wait to watch crumble. I didn't, he said just as the cannon collided with its true target. It hit the side of the snowy mountain, and the impact shifted the snow. Eijirou could see it from here, the distribution of the snow as it began to cascade down the cliff, headed for all of the soldiers in the pass. Rappa's eyes widened as he watched the snow begin to fall, bringing more snow with it until a massive avalanche was headed their way within seconds. Eijirou felt a sick sense of satisfaction twist in his gut as Rappa's expression fell into a cold fury. Why you? He growled and raised his fists, winding both of his arms back to strike. Eijirou gasped and tried to stumble back, to harden his body and brace for the blows, but there wasn't much he could do, sitting in the snow. Rappa's fists swung through the air in a wild arc, and Eijirou moved along with it, collapsing in the snow and raising his arms. Oddly enough, he didn't even feel the pain he should be experiencing. It was like it never happened. Adrenaline erasing his pain, even as his skin started to chip away, even when he started to bleed. It could have gone on for hours, for a few minutes, and the redhead wouldn't have known. All he feels is when the pounding stops and the villain starts to scream. Eijirou stumbles to his feet and began to sprint away, as fast as he could, and Rappa let him, his body shaking with fury as the snow came closer. The snow would descend upon him and the rest of the army any moment, and he didn't want to be whisked away with it. He spotted Bakugo out of the corner of his eye, running towards him. Bakugo! Eijirou roars, stumbling toward him as they both ran from the avalanche. Bakugo opened his mouth to reply, shouting something that might have been his name. But Eijirou couldn't hear anything over the roar of the snow. Tokoyami raced towards the pair, ever the faithful horse, and Eijirou mounted him with practiced precision, shifting the unconscious soldier to make room. He held out his hand and Bakugo grabbed it. Eijirou heaved with all his might, desperately trying to haul the captain onto Tokoyami, but the snow had caught up to them. It hit them like a wave and Tokoyami stumbled, being pushed down the mountain. Eijirou lost any weak grip he had on Bakugo. Baku! He shouted as the captain was dragged away by the rush of snow. Tokoyami galloped around, but managed to keep upright. Eijirou spurred the horse on, into the direction Bakugo disappeared into. What are you doing? Denki demanded as he and Jiro popped out of his sash. I need to find Bakugo! Eijirou shouted, leaning down to fish around in the snow. Don't let yourself get killed trying to impress Loverboy, Denki advised. Eijirou grit his teeth, glancing amongst the avalanche they were precariously surfing on. It was just a sea of white. A white-out slate, nothing else. But he spotted a flash out of the corner of his eye, a rare dot of colour. Eijirou whipped his head around, desperate not to lose it. There was Bakugo, knocked out from the tide of snow. Eijirou spurred on Tokoyami, and they made their way over. The redhead leaned down, scooping the blonde out of the snow and hauling him onto the horse. One thing down, now that Bakugo was safely atop the horse, Eijirou needed to find them somewhere safe to wait the avalanche out. He knew Tokoyami couldn't tread the snow forever. He looked over towards the outcropping of rocks they were hiding behind earlier. The rocks were angled in such a way that the snow moved over them, and the redhead could see what was left of the army hiding underneath. He spurred on Tokoyami and the horse began to trek down to the rocks. Eijirou thought they would make it. He didn't predict an extra wave of snow to come along. Jiro chirped, frantic and shrill, and that was the only warning he had before the snow was pushing their party down, down, down. Eijirou desperately tried to shift around with Tokoyami so that the horse could regain his balance. But it was of no use. The edge of the mountain was getting closer and closer, and if nothing changed, the snow was going to push them off the cliff. He frantically looked around for something, anything, that would get them out of this, but came up empty. He had thought that he was so clever when the idea came to set off the avalanche, but maybe it wasn't such a great idea after all. But over the roaring of the snow, Eijirou heard a whistling sound. He glanced up and saw an arrow flying right towards them, a rope trailing after. A chance! Eijirou snatched it out of the air and tied the rope around Tokoyami's saddle with shaking hands, holding on for dear life as the snow carried them over the cliff. Eijirou shut his eyes tight as Denki shrieked, clutching the two unconscious men to his body, praying that at least they would survive. They dropped down, 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 until they stopped. The rope snagged, and then hung in mid-air, the snow cascading around them. Then slowly, ever so slowly, they began to ascend. Denki and Jiro clung tightly to Eijirou as the three men were hauled up back onto the cliff. The remaining soldiers were heaving away on the rope, working with all their might to pull them back up, and Tokoyami hopped back onto the cliff with a snort. Eijirou didn't waste any time in dismounting, eager to be back on solid ground now that the avalanche had stopped. He hauled the blonde along with him, who was beginning to stir. "Kirishima?" he asked groggily, as eijirou set them both on the ground, falling to his knees. The blonde blinked, looking around as the pass was now void of the League, and the remaining soldiers who had gathered around them. Realization seemed to light in his eyes. "You fucking saved me!" Bakugo breathed. eijirou managed a weak grin. Yeah, I guess I did." Bakugo's lips quivered into a smile, and eijirou was reminded of their talk at the burning village, another peek into the usually stoic Katsuki Bakugo's emotions. "Thanks, dumbass! You're a good soldier, Kirishima, for a redhead." "Rude!" eijirou laughed softly, the adrenaline finally beginning to seep from his veins. And as it trickled out, a tingling in his abdomen, the rest of his body, started to seep in. Why did his armor feel sticky? "Here's to eijirou Kirishima, the bravest of us all!" Midoriya shouted, and the soldiers erupted into a chorus of cheers. eijirou stared up at them, but it was like he was seeing double. Everything seemed too bright, and the edges of things blurry and swaying. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, but nothing changed. The tingling began to give way to a sharp pain. Bakugo held out a hand, and eijirou reached out to take it, feeling dizzy. The blonde hauled him to his feet, the warmth of his palm, eijirou's only grounding point. Standing was a mistake. eijirou gasped sharply. He glanced down and found his hand soaked in blood. Blood? He could only make out a red splotch through his swimming vision. His hands trembled. The pain in his body doubled, sharp and biting, and eijirou felt his legs give out as he curled in on himself. The memories came flooding back, lighting the cannon, Rappa's look of fury, the blow as it descended upon him. There were voices calling out to him. They sounded like they were drowned in white noise, but they were still there. Through the chaos, eijirou managed to pick out Bakugo's voice. "Hold on, Kirishima!" That was the last thing he registered before the world went black. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. I have to admit that this chapter allowed me to use the scope of my emotional range, and I loved it. I also loved still having a character who was assumed to be a female within a man's army. It works so well. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, XX Cypress Minerva XX on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel, and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!